So the War of 1812 is what we're up to now. And in the War of 1812, this is sometimes seen as the Second War of Independence because it was against the British again. Now, the British and French had fought for a long period of time, over a decade, during something called the Napoleonic Wars. And this was when Napoleon was wandering around France, conquering a good portion of Europe. At one point, it looked like he might try and invade Britain, and if that had happened, then, well, history would be very different. And the backdrop of this is important to understand that some of the stuff in Napoleon coming to power was related to the French Revolution, and some people argued that the French Revolution happened because the American Revolution was supported by the French, and the French went ahead and spent so much money helping the Americans that they sort of went bankrupt, and then that caused lots of problems in the French economy and the French monarchy. But that's more about the French than it is about the Americans, but it's just an interesting point anyhow. So some people thought that it should take the French side, the US should take the French side because the French side was, at least originally, it seemed to be okay. But then it became a lot more radical with Napoleon being in charge, and he was a dictator. He crowned himself emperor, and then the U.S. isn't into that. Some people thought we should take the British side because we were kind of British still, and on top of that, it was against the the emperor Napoleon, and a lot of people thought we should remain neutral, and we tried to do that. Um, most of the presidents tried to do that, but there were these times when what ended up happening was that the British would get involved with the Americans and naval vessels, or the French would, because both the British and the French wanted the American vessels to trade with them and not trade with the other side. And they wanted a lot of extra ships, and so sometimes they just took them. Now, James Madison, he's the president at the time, and one of the things that's always fascinating to me is this idea that James Madison, in the first several presidents in the United States history, just about all of them were from Virginia. Because you go ahead and you look through it, you see how George Washington was from Virginia, then Thomas Jefferson, then James Madison, then James Monroe, and each of them served a total of 2 terms each. And so that's basically, let's see here, that's 6 terms, make that 7, 8 terms, and then only one was not from Virginia, and that was John Adams, who was from Massachusetts. But anyhow, going back to that, the James Madison, he was the president at the time, and the British took American ships, so did the French, but also the British went ahead and said, hey, these sailors, they used to be British, we can take them too, because we need sailors, and these guys can sail, and that really offended a lot of people. This was called impressing, and it was just basically kidnapping and forcing them to serve in the Navy. Now, a group named the Warhawks wanted war. This guy here, his name is Henry Clay, and he ran for president, I think, 4 times. Wasn't successful, but he came pretty close a couple of times. But he was a really important member of the House of Representatives, and or the Senate, I'm not 100% sure on that. I thought it was the House of Representatives, but still, he was a really important member in Congress. And what ended up happening was that he really pushed the U.S. towards war because he felt that Britain was messing with the U.S. rights and they weren't being respected. Eventually, Congress did declare war. Now, when they did declare war, this is how the U.S. looked during this time period. If you look here, this is, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio have been added, sorted out some of the border disputes. The territories are starting to be added. Louisiana is a state also, so you got this territory in here. And if you look, these are all the main campaigns that happened, and I may come back to this in a little bit, but the red ones were the British movements, the blue ones were the American movements, and the British Navy was the strongest navy in the world by far, and we were just kind of getting started still. However, the U.S. did have some occasional success, including the battle with the USS Constitution, which is nicknamed Old Ironside because supposedly cannonballs would bounce right off its sides. It fought in the not only along the coast here, but also in the Great Lakes, and well, it was Yeah, the U.S. had the advantage of being here, so they could always call up reinforcements. The British had the disadvantage of not being here, but also they had that other war to fight as well. But the British did have an ally over here, and that was the Native Americans, because they figured, you know what, let's stir up trouble for the Americans, and so they supported the Native Americans against the British, or against the British supported them against the Americans, and they helped provide them with weapons and other things as well. One of the most successful, or the most successful leader, was a guy named Tecumseh. He was a Shawnee Indian, and what ended up happening was he was able to get people to put aside their differences of the different tribes and work together. And the idea of, let's just stop these settlers, European settlers, from moving into our land, because they just keep taking and taking. Eventually, Tecumseh, who did die, and what ended up happening then was things sort of fell apart after that from the resistance. That was not after. This here is William Henry Harrison. Yes, the guy who was only president for a few weeks, but he became very famous during this time period because he fought the Battle of Tippecanoe, which was a major engagement during the war, and that was a big American victory. Also, Andrew Jackson fought against the Creek tribe in Florida, which is not fighting against the British, but still, it's pretty clear that the Native Americans were not happy with what was going on with all the territorial expansions. One thing that really was interesting was that the Federalist Party kind of fell apart during this time period because there were some in the North. The Federalist Party was always more popular in the Northeast with like New York City and big cities and things like that. And while we were fighting the British, the Federalist Party, some people in that party went ahead and actually tried to negotiate with the British and went ahead and sort of threatened or started exploring the possibility of seceding from the Union, leaving the United States, so that they could then be their own country because they didn't like not trading with Britain because that's where they got a lot of their money. And so when this came out later after the war was over, that these Federalists were negotiating with the British while we were fighting the British, that was kind of the end of the Federalist Party because they were kind of viewed as traitors, and they kind of were. So what did end up happening at one point was that the United States did have its capital burned at Washington, D.C., and you can see that in the background, the White House being burned. And the reason why the White House is because they had to paint it over to cover up all the burn marks. And by 1814, France had lost to Britain and now Britain was able to focus more on the Americans. And they surrounded the coast, stopped shipping. Baltimore was attacked, but the fort that protected the harbor there did not fall. That's what the whole Star Spangled Banner is all about. And it did not fall, so the flag was still there. Now, the British did burn public buildings in Washington, D.C., and some people argue that this was because the United States went up into Canada at one point and burned down a city called York, and then they went ahead and said basically, oops, didn't mean to do that, so the British came in and deliberately burned down the capital. The War of 1812 basically ended in a stalemate. Nothing much was resolved, and peace was negotiated, but it took weeks to get that message across the Atlantic, which is always going to be a problem because while that's happening, people are still fighting. Now, Andrew Jackson, probably the reason why Andrew Jackson, or one of the main reasons why he became so popular, was because while he thinks the war is still going on, he's defending himself against the British who are trying to take New Orleans. And he sets it up perfectly. He knows that they can only go one way, though, whether this is kind of a swampy area here, the approach to New Orleans, this is the Mississippi River, so they can only go this part here. It's kind of muddy, and he sets up these trenches, and then he just knows that they're marching up, and it comes up that the Americans lose 50 people in terms of casualties, the British lose 2,000. So it's a tremendous victory. The great irony is that the war was actually over, so it shouldn't have ever been fought. But it does provide a big moral boost on some level because the U.S. won that big battle, and it certainly helps Jackson's political career. Because if you notice, generals who are successful do pretty well in politics. George Washington and certainly then Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison can attest to that. Lots of others like Dwight Eisenhower, people like that too. So And during this time period, there's no real political opposition to the Democratic Republicans because the Federalist Party has fallen apart. And Monroe was the Secretary of State under Madison. This is how it worked generally. If you were Secretary of State, then the next time around, if your party ran, and the presidents, they only ran for 2 terms. That's sort of following in Washington's footsteps. But the idea is that then you'd be Secretary of State, and then you would be elected president or possibly elected president the next time around. You'd be the candidate. And this is what happened, that Monroe became president pretty much without much opposition and all. So it's called the Era of Good Feelings because there's really not a lot of fighting going on. At this point, this is a map from 1820, 1821 about. So you can see, yes, the states are growing bigger and bigger. The one church that started, this is very interesting. There's a church that started during this time period. And this is the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was established in 1816. This church was in Philadelphia, and it was the first church officially for African Americans, but welcome to all people. And this was started, one of the main people involved was a pastor, preacher named Richard Allen. So that's his picture there. And one of the things that happened also around the rest of the Western Hemisphere was this idea that a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies became independent because they just didn't want to be with Europe anymore. And when they became independent, one of the big worries was that other nations would try and sneak over and take those or deliberately take those. And Monroe said basically, no, stay out of our hemisphere. We will stay out of European wars if you stay out of our hemisphere. And that's been basically a policy that's been in effect really since then on some of this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. And you can see sort of the idea of how that works.